everyone, welcome back. Or if you're new, my name is Ilani and I'm a grower here at Flower World. And today we're going to talk about watering. Okay, so when it comes to your plants, there's certain things that you need to think about. What kind of plant it is, what kind of potting medium it is, whether it's in a pot or the ground. Today, since we're here at the nursery, I'll be showing you some examples of how to water plants that are planted in pots. And so when you're watering your plants, you always want to think about your medium and balancing the amount of soil, water, and air that you have in your pot. And you want to be cautious of not overwatering or underwatering, because then that stresses the plant out. And when a plant is stressed out, that can cause it to be more prone to diseases and pests. Okay, so when you're watering, there's different ways you can look at a plant to see whether it even needs water in the first place or not. Some plants can show you that it needs water by what it's called wilting. If you notice this plant, I know it's dry because its leaves are droopy, kind of curling, versus this plant that's well watered. It's nice and stiff and green, and the foliage is nice and healthy. But some plants don't wilt, or it shows wilting in a different way, and you can't tell. So one thing that you could also do if you're growing your plants in a pot is by lifting it up. So obviously this one, it has no water. It's much lighter than this pot that has water because you have more in your pot. Sometimes that's hard when you're now dealing with bigger plants because sometimes it has a well-developed root system, so it feels heavy, but the soil underneath is actually still dry. And so another way to tell whether a plant needs water or not, if it's in a pot, is by taking the pot and do what we call tipping, which is just flipping it over and revealing the soil. And so you can see here on this one, I don't know if you can tell in the video, it's got some moisture on the bottom, but for the most part, our soil is quite dry. While we look at this pot that was just recently watered, if I tip it, well, even moisture throughout the soil, but it's also not overwatered, meaning that the water takes up all the air pockets. When I mentioned earlier, you want a balance of soil, water, and oxygen, because roots need oxygen. You want to make sure that all of your soil or your particles are wet itself, but they're still not too wet so that air can still get through and allow the roots to breathe. Sometimes too, when you look at plants, might be a little bit more for the developed eye or gardener. Some plants will turn its foliage kind of like a grayish color when it's dry, while when they're well watered or watered, enough, the foliage will be a much brighter green, looking more alive and less wilty. All right, and next we're going to get into watering techniques. All right, we figured out which plants need watering, so let's get to it. Now, when watering plants, especially if your soil is very dry, think of it like if you had a very dried out dish sponge, and when you first run water over it, it's what we call hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't soak up the water right away. The same thing happens with soil, especially if you let it dry out too much. And so, like a dish sponge, when you're watering, think of it, if you run water just one time over it, it didn't really fully absorb all the water. So sometimes you're going to have to run your water over your plants several times to allow the sponge to get wet and then start accepting and absorbing the water that you're putting on it. And so I like to do what we call passes. So if I take my hose and turn my water on, of course, always make sure that your water is cool and not burning hot from the sun. And this whole table needs water. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass over it one time evenly. And then I'm going to turn my water off. And what I like to do is then what we did earlier is tip the pot and see whether the soil got fully wet or not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, depending on your pot size and how much soil you have or how dry it is. So we can see on this pot, see the surface right here and the bottom got wet, but the middle is completely dry. So that's a great example of how one pass, you know, you might think that you watered it, but really you just got the foliage wet and the top layer of soil wet. But we want to make sure, especially on the hot day, that all of our soil is evenly saturated. And so I'm going to put this back in the pot, and I'd give this table a couple more passes and then check again to make sure that my plants are well watered. And I also want to make sure that they're not overwatered. So you want just the right amount of water for nice healthy plants to grow. Okay, quick tip. Say you have a really big plant like this that's in a really big pot and you aren't able to tip your pot, or say you want to check your garden that's in the ground. Something that you can do is get, like, say, a wooden popsicle stick or a wooden chopstick and stick it all the way in your soil as far as it can go, and leave it in there for, let's say, 10 minutes and come back and pull it out. If it's wet, that means your plant is watered. If it's fully dry, that means it needs water. All right, before I go, one last tip: the right time of day to water your plants, especially right now while it's hot out, it's summertime, and you're going to be needing to water your plants every day right now when it's hot, because again, they're plants, they need water. It's hot, water evaporates, so keep an eye on your plants. But when you water, you're going to want to water in the morning when it's cooler out and the plants are least stressed. And also that way, the foliage or the leaves will have time to dry out through the day, and it'll prevent it from rotting. Versus if you were to water closer to the evening time or even at nighttime, there's a higher chance that you could rot your foliage, because then now it's sitting in water and you don't want that. You also don't want to water in the middle of the afternoon when it's at its hottest point in the day. Some plants are more sensitive and could potentially burn. Water kind of can act like a magnifying glass and intensify that summer sun heat. So keep in mind when and where you water. Okay, everyone. Well, that's all I have on our tips and tricks on how to water in containers. If you have any questions, go ahead and list them in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Bye.